Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ferry. Welcome to another rebroadcast from the RTB archives.
There has to be some way of imagining democratic equality that doesn't sidestep historically derived differences.
From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, a podcast that looks backwards to see into the future. Our idea is to assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events by looking at books that shaped the world we inherited. Today, the hosts are John Plotz, professor of English from Brandeis. Hello, John. And we are joined by Ajantha Subramanian. And the topic for today will be meritocracy and privilege in higher education. Ajantha is professor of anthropology and South Asian studies at Harvard University. Her first book, Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India, published in 2009 by Stanford University Press, chronicles the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers on India's southwestern coast. Her new book is called The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, and it was published in 2019 by Harvard University Press. In it, she studies students and alumni of the Indian Institutes of Technology, focusing on questions of meritocracy and democracy in India in order to understand the production of merit as a form of caste property and its implications for democratic transformation. So, Ajantha, could you start and tell us a little bit about the project, what inspired you to do it, and maybe a little bit what the fieldwork was like?
Sure. And so I want to say that this project has been in the making for most of my life because I've been surrounded by engineers for most of my life, many of whom members of my own family, and have been told repeatedly, especially by opinionated uncles, that my choice of anthropology was a frivolous one. And I was only able to make it because my father worked in international development and was able to afford me the luxury of pursuing whims. Right. So I was always
Not a real study.
and not a real study. Yeah. So so sort of implied in that was both that the social sciences weren't real. That they were sort of flimsy.
Very familiar to me.
They were flimsy forms of knowledge, but also that I didn't have to think about my bread and butter, right? That because my father had left India and was a dollar earner, that I, didn't have to think in terms of social mobility, right? So, I think that this irritation at being sort of dismissed so easily was always sort of with me.
So would you say this book is retaliation?
But I also think it was just being exposed to an incredibly shrill politics around merit in India, and especially the kind of backlash against expanding affirmative action within the technical sciences. So that's something else that I was privy to for decades. And then coming to Harvard, where, the language of merit is all around you. And, there are sort of assumptions about individual talent and desert that totally sort of sidestep the question of structural inequality and inherited advantages and disadvantages. So I think the combination of all of these things sort of led me to the book. I suppose the kind of biggest argument of the book is that claims to merit are expressions of upper casteness, right? I mean, that meritocracy as a politics is an identitarian politics, right?
And merit gets marked how in this, like in your case study, this is through IIT, is that the...
Yeah, so there's the site where I did the study was a set of institutions called the Indian Institutes of Technology, which are sort of the cream of undergraduate education in India, and especially undergraduate technical education. They're impossible to get into. There's an annual exam every year where up to 1 million people take the exam, and under 3% get in. So it's like an incredibly competitive ordeal.
And they're like billboards and things, posting the winners and stuff.
Exactly. I mean, these institutions are a household word. They're a kind of proven means to professional advancement and social mobility. So, and they're also seen as these kind of havens of meritocracy within a national education system, which is kind of mediocre, which fails its students, et cetera, et cetera. So these institutions are seen as holding out the kind of the promise of true merit, right?
And they're public institutions.
They're public institutions.
Which is a big difference with some of the institutions regarded as elite in the United States.
Absolutely, yeah. They're public institutions, but highly, highly selective public institutions, right? So,
and are they understood as democratizing? Like, is there a rhetoric that goes back to the founding of the state or not that far that sees them as part of a democratizing project? Or
so I think in general, technical education is seen as democratizing, right? So, from the early 20th century on, and especially after independence, you had massive state investment in technical training, as a kind of corollary in the education field of this broader commitment to technologically driven modernization, right? So, I mean, there was an explosion of institutions post-independence. But interestingly, this one set of institutions, the IITs, were always set apart from this kind of larger impetus to democratize access to higher education, right? So they were seen as exceptional, right? They were set apart as institutions of excellence, and this is actually what they were called, institutions of excellence, of national excellence. And there's this amazing quote from Nehru in the sort of early days when the pros and cons of creating this new hyper exclusive tier of public institutions was being debated in the parliament. And he said, this is a paraphrase, but something along the lines of, democracy is a good thing, but unfortunately, it can lead to mediocrity, right? So, and that there are certain spaces which should be set apart from the equity mandate, right? Should be set apart as spaces of excellence.
Right.
So these were always seen as exceptional, right? So public but exceptional. Right? Public but
no, it makes me wish I knew the French example better, because I feel like in France they're similar. They have the kind of plucked universities. I mean, there's a large state access, like you said, I mean, funded by the state, but that there are this sites of selection as well.
Right.
But I mean, I'm sure in America we can think of 100 ways that the parallel plays out too.
Yeah.
Think about the earlier tradition of the Ivy Leagues, and then something like MIT, which is a technology institute, but on the other hand, it also somehow exists in that same.
And also those so-called public Ivies, right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And even within the big public university systems, there's always like the flagship institution, right? Which is seen as more excellent than the rest.
Yes.
Right?
And just to complete the sort of description of your argument, most of the people who end up in the IITs are Brahmin.
Not Brahmin, but upper caste.
Okay.
Which is a kind of broader category.
Right.
So one of the ways that this set of institutions was kind of set apart from the larger sort of project of equalizing access to education was they were exempted from caste-based affirmative action. So until, so through the first 2 decades after their founding, there was no affirmative action at all.
Whereas there was for other universities.
Whereas there were for even the very next tier of institutions, right? And I mean, the thing I should say is that unlike the next tier of institutions, many of which were regionally administered, so they were administered at the regional level. This set of institutions was centrally administered, so they came under the purview of the federal government instead of the regional authorities. And so the regional quotas for lower caste that existed did not apply to these institutions, right? And so they were set apart from affirmative action, and so it had the obvious result of making the student body overwhelmingly both upper caste and also upper middle class, although there were some exceptions. But But this in the 1970s, the central government did introduce one set of quotas for the lowest tier of social groups. So the scheduled castes, who are now called the Dalits, and scheduled tribes. But the sort of overall state of education was such that they rarely filled those quotas. And it was only in the 1990s and 2000s that new quotas were introduced for the intermediate rung of castes,
who might in fact be more likely to actually end up in the
who were actually much more of a threat, right, to kind of upper caste hegemony of these institutions.
So can I ask you to gloss out one of my favorite sentences in this awesome book? You say that the leveraging of merit must be seen as an expression of upper caste identitarianism that attempts to forestall progress towards a more egalitarian society and derives its legitimacy from a larger global politics of ascription. And I kind of want to go back to larger global politics because I think that is a really interesting place to think about the U.S. situation. But can you just talk about the leveraging of merit, which I feel like that's a crucial idea for you, and I'd love to hear you say more about that.
Yeah. So I mean, this must be familiar to people who are not familiar with India. That merit becomes this way of claiming one's successes, be they educational or professional, as the product of hard work, right? Of hard work, of
talent,
individual ability, certain kinds of sort of innate qualities, right? So merit becomes a way of bracketing structural considerations altogether, right? So one of the things that's so evident at these institutions, and also in India more generally, is every time there's a kind of claim on a previously kind of exclusive institutional space, right? Whether it's the state, so the state bureaucracy, or, higher educational institutions, the pushback is typically in the language of merit. Right? We have to preserve merit at all costs, right? That to allow access to new groups, to allow them entry on different grounds, right? Would be to undercut an incredibly important democratic principle, right? And the democratic principle is the principle of meritocracy.
So that makes total sense to me. But can you say more about the leveraging of merit must be seen as an expression of upper caste identitarianism? Yeah. Because I think naively, I think of identitarianism as deliberately embraced ascriptive identity.
As explicit.
Yeah, as explicit. Whereas what you're describing sounds to me like it's a kind of misrecognition or a proxy.
So, I mean, I should say that I don't know what the response to this book is going to be, but I expect that the thing that my interlocutors will hate the most is being called caste subjects, right? I don't think that they'll care at all about the leveraging part.
Yeah.
Right.
Because, they believe that the world is one of competition, right? That groups are in a tussle with other groups, and you use whatever means there are at your disposal to get ahead. That idea, I think, would be fine with them. What I think they would object to is being seen as expressing caste identity through those forms of leveraging. So they do see themselves as a kind of corporate unit, right? But the corporate identity is an institutional one. They see themselves as IITians, or a kind of occupational one. They see themselves as engineers. So there are all these corporate
brand identity
that they are completely comfortable with. But caste, I think, is one that they actively disavow.
Right.
And they don't disavow it as culture. So what I mean by that is, so if I ask them, what's your caste background? I think many of them would say what it is, right? But to see it as a structural advantage is something that they would strongly object to.
But so is that then a language? Is there a kind of implicit tokenism then? They will cite an example of some friend of theirs, a fellow IIT,
didn't get in?
No, who's not of their caste. Like in other words, there's Joe, who's a Dalit.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Because I feel like that's in America, that's my black friend,
right.
We remember that, that's like a sitcom move.
Yeah, yeah. But here, I mean, it's interesting because more than that, there's a kind of claim that caste was invisible to them at least within the space of the institution. And that this is something that, again, sets the IITs apart from the rest of Indian society.
You don't see caste while you don't see caste while you're
in it. Because we're all just like other people.
Being smart,
right? We're just all being smart together, right? And that you leave behind all of these unfortunate, right? Carryovers from a kind of pre-modern past. Right. You leave those all behind and you enter the space of the institution and you're kind of remade, right?
And is the idea that sort of makes people kind of on the springboard to global citizenship? Like they're...
Well, global, but also national.
Okay, both.
Like there's something really important about a national project of transcending caste, right?
But then how is that identitarianism? I think I still don't get that. Because that feels like it structurally might legitimate people in upper caste position. You can still benefit from your status. But isn't identitarianism predicated on positively claiming belonging
So Stuart Hall has this interesting argument about race not always speaking in its own language, right? That there are other descriptors, other forms of discursive self-marking that stand in for race, right? And you recognize it as race based on what it is arrayed against, right? So in this instance, this kind of corporate identity is not just leveraged as a means to, whatever, accumulation, advancement, etc. It's also pitted against something, right? And the thing that it's pitted against is lower caste, right? So it's a kind of disidentification with this other corporate group. And it's that kind of binary formulation of what one is that allows you to see that this is in fact a form of upper caste. Right? Yeah. So that kind of the oppositional framing is super important, right? And that's what kind of calls the lie to this as non-identitarian, right? Like they use a universalistic lange to describe themselves, but it's also one that's antithetical to certain other groupings, right? And that's kind of
so it's in the positioning.
It's in the position vis-a-vis other groups. Who, of course, they charge with being identitarian, right? Right? So, and it's a similar thing with...
Which is why you think they'll react strongly against this.
Yes.
Because you think they will say, oh, no, that's what my opponents are doing.
Yeah, that's not what we're doing.
That's not what I'm doing.
Yeah. In fact, we're against caste.
Yeah.
Right? And we're against the politics of caste.
Right.
So one of the things that's very exciting about the argument is the way that it mobilizes other kinds of languages about other kinds of categories, maybe especially whiteness. You talk about upper casteness, which I think is your term, right?
It's my awkward neologism.
Right, but it's in order to invoke whiteness, right? That a process is, and you talk about it as property and as a possessive accumulation, so you're sort of drawing on these other conversations about whiteness. And this to a non-Indianist, non-specialist in India, maybe especially an anthropologist, but probably more broadly, is really interesting because caste is often thought of as being, radically different from race on the one hand and class on the other. And you're sort of showing the complex ways in which its sort of mechanism is the same.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, and I'm certainly not the only one who's done this. Lots of people have argued for making caste more obviously comparable, right, to other systems of social stratification, right? That caste is so often kind of seen as the emblematic marker of Indian cultural difference, something that is so particular that it can't be compared or discussed alongside anything.
Or it can only be compared on the basis of its radical difference.
Yes.
As a kind of foil.
I mean, I teach a course called Race and Caste, and it's very interesting. All of the kind of non-Indian, non-South Asian students in the class were initially very nervous about the caste literature that we were covering, because they assumed that it would never be familiar to them.
Right.
And and the structure of the course was such that they were forced to think them together, right? So like every module was on a certain topic, like the plantation, where you see how the plantation as a technology has produced both caste and race, and the census has produced both caste and race, and so
oh, nice,
Anyway,
so in that class, do you have a configuration for the triangle that Elizabeth alluded to, like caste, class, and race? Yeah.
I mean, part of the point of the class is to insist that one of the reasons caste and race are comparable is because of a history of capitalist transformation, right? So caste and class, caste and race were were sort of instruments for the expansion of an imperial political economy. And so it's important.
And a nationalization of difference that is smooths that process.
Yeah, but also that one cannot think about class formation outside of these other categories, right? So when you think about class formation in a place like India or class formation in the United States, it was always rooted through these sort of so-called ascriptive categories, right? Of race and caste. So, so class was never something that operated in isolation from. So it's less a kind of argument about intersectionality. Intersectionality still keeps these things as like separate structures that then
Right.
But I'm saying that class formation is inherently a caste process. Right. You can't think about it outside of caste.
Good. I hope you said that. Good. Yeah, it seems like a good connection.
This seems like a good moment to introduce our second text, which is really bringing to the forefront these kinds of comparisons. The text is by Seamus Khan. It's called Privilege: The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, and it was published in 2011 by Princeton. And Khan was a student at St. Paul's. He's also a South Asian American. And he then became a teacher as a sociologist. So he was a teacher at St. Paul's, but it was understood that he was doing his sociological study of St. Paul's as part of it. And he makes a really interesting argument about a kind of shift in the way in which privilege is mobilized over the past, I can't remember exactly, the few decades, let's say, since probably he was a student.
It's not that long.
No, it's not that long.
20 years.
I was going to say 30 years seems like long to me.
Maybe saying
a lot shorter than
maybe
that.
shorter.
Data from the
although I feel like even by the
Psycho
80s it was sort of starting. But anyhow,
read is good.
Well, specifically this shift from sort of privilege as being marked by the kind of boundaries that you can keep and the way that you can keep people out. From a much more kind of, in some ways, immediately seemingly appealing mode of privilege, but also maybe more insidious because of that, which is sort of privilege as this ease of being able to go anywhere, right? Like now you don't have to buy stuff from Brooks Brothers, you can buy stuff from Target, but it's your ability to buy stuff from Target and Brooks Brothers that kind of marks you as privileged.
Can I just quote his 3 lessons of privilege, because they seem so great. They're great, and yet they're so paradoxical. But okay, so the 3 lessons are: 1, hierarchies are natural and can be used to one's advantage. 2, experiences matter more than innate or inherited qualities. So worth unpacking. And 3, the way to signal your elite status to others is through ease and openness in all social contexts. Inequality is ever present, but elites now view it as fair.
Right.
So ease and openness, yes, but not democratic level.
Right.
So you get to go everywhere, but you go everywhere across difference.
And and there's a differential distribution of the ability to go everywhere.
Absolutely.
And he talks about seeing hierarchies as ladders you can climb. Right. And this idea that that everyone has opportunity, right, stands in for a true commitment to equality, right? right?
Yeah.
So opportunity takes the place of equality.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, it seems sort of an extension or it's making the language of merit even more flexible, right? Because it makes it into this kind of traveling quality that isn't just linked to what used to be called breeding or accent or all these kinds of things.
Yeah, and that's partly the alibi, right? But as he says, St. Paul's has changed, right? I mean, it looks more like the world, or like the nation, I suppose. Except, you scratch the surface and you realize that, in terms of class, for instance,
right,
there is still a uniformity, to who is able to come, right? But it's this idea that the doors are now open, and people can come in, and that the new kind of outsiders, right, are the ones from these old elite families, right? The ones who think that they're simply entitled to St. Paul's because their legacy admits. I mean, they're the ones who are now seen as not embodying the spirit of
deeply uncool.
The institution.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it is, yes, it may look like more like the nation, and there may even be some class diversity, but the experience of St. Paul's is radically different for those different students, right?
Absolutely.
And the ways in which they are made to feel like they belong or not.
Yeah. So by the end, I mean, you see that working class kids and non-white kids are able to inhabit that ease in the same way, right? Yeah. And especially if they insist on keeping their own backgrounds in the foreground, right? They're seen as somehow sort of intransigent, right?
There's an interesting anthropological article about diversity as a resource on college campuses.
Yeah.
And it's sort of connected to this, right? It's like the working class and students of color who are there are sort of there partly to be mobilized, not necessarily to mobilize themselves, right? So if they don't kind of play that role effectively, then there are costs.
Yeah, so this one Black girl that he writes about is somewhat friendless because, she's so aware of, all the people from her neighborhood who aren't at St. Paul's, right? Even as her presence is being celebrated, she's so acutely aware of how exclusionary the space actually is, right? And no one wants to remind us of that.
Well, I think
that wasn't supposed to be her job, but coming there, right?
I think I plugged this book before, but that Anthony Jackson about the privileged poor, I think it's fascinating about that, just like kind of giving that as a sort of more granularity to that way that you can arrive and then serve the purpose of diversity for others' benefit.
Exactly.
No, I feel like the insight about access is not the same as equality is the crucial one there.
I mean, I guess the difference is that he's really emphasizing this discontinuity between a kind of older cohort, right, and this kind of newer group. And I don't. I was thinking about whether that applied to the IITs, and I think it does and it doesn't. Well,
here's where I think the public character of the institution and it's sort of part of being sort of created as part of a national project makes a difference, right? That was not what St. Paul's was invented for.
No. But also the
it was always supposed to educate the sons of the elite, right?
Right.
That was what it was for.
Right. But here the majority of the IITs are actually, and this is part of their claim to merit, is that they're not from the industrial elite or the business elite or even necessarily the landed elite. These are the children of civil servants, right? These are people who really kind of entered the professional class through the state, right? I mean, they are beneficiaries of state developmentalism, right? Whether in the colonial or post-colonial period. But they're upper caste. So this combination of being upper caste and middle class, I think, makes for a different story than the one that Seamus Khan is telling.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So perhaps we should shift to recallable books.
Yeah, that
Seem like a good moment.
it does. Actually, can I just look? I just have one. I have such an inchoate question, so you guys can give a sharp answer to a dumb question, which is that in terms of the temporality of the disjunction here, I'm still trying to think about how this relates to kind of the most current rise of ethno-nationalism.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, I heard you mention Trump really quickly, but I was just thinking about, obviously there's a way in which certainly the privilege book fits into a narrative about, some of the internal contradictions of neoliberalism, right?
Yeah.
So that's an account that goes back to the 80s because it's about Reagan and it's about the rise of a kind of, global meritocracy that refuses to name its own class status or something like that. But here we are, we're probably 10 years into some different habitus or some different ethos. So how does the argument fit into that? Like you talk about, you talk some about, the rise of nationalism in the Indian context.
Yeah.
So can we talk about like that whiteness and upper casteness as distinctly new?
Yeah. I mean, I do. So, part of what I'm trying to do in the book is say that this kind of comfortable way of inhabiting a kind of universal subjectivity, right? A kind of unmarked status. That is increasingly the ability to do that is increasingly challenged by oppositional movements, right? Whether they are low caste movements in India or minority rights movements, et cetera, in the U.S., right? So there's a way that, the kind of the universal subject is exposed as actually being marked, right? And being marked by caste or race or...
Right.
And so what happens when that challenge is posed, right? And I think that what happens is that suddenly a kind of commitment to liberal universalism phrase, right? And there's a kind of there's a retreat, right, into a much more kind of defensive posture, right, and a much more explicit claim to identity.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that does not seem to be what's happening in Kahn's book. They seem to be doubling down on
the liberal individualism.
Yeah. How long, if he wrote it, I mean, it was published in 2011, so let's say the work was 2008.
I would be curious. Whether there would be a difference now.
Yeah.
Right? So I do. There's been this kind of like a return to a much more kind of explicit claim to racial or caste superiority.
Yeah.
But it's not the old racial or caste superiority because it's still kind of blended with notions of meritocracy. Right?
Yeah.
So...
and you see that return as a cultural outgrowth of responses to minoritarian movements. So it's explicitly sort of provoked by this egalitarian possibility.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a kind of the more the push to share the pie and not just be benevolent patrons.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
the more there's a kind of
not be the ones who set the terms of how the pie is shared.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The more there's this kind of return, and then which begs the question of where's this all heading? Right.
Yeah. Right.
If that's the response, is there any possibility for a kind of a shared politics, right?
Yeah.
Which is actually about egalitarianism, right? And not just the recognition of multiple differences or whatever it is. And I don't know. I mean, I do think that there has to be some way of imagining democratic equality that doesn't sidestep historically derived differences, right? I mean, one has to work through those in order to achieve a kind of proper equality that's not just nominal, right? It's where it's actually a sort of substantive form of equality. And I think one of the reasons why a kind of the sort of the earlier form of universalism was so hollow is because it was about the transcendence of difference and not about the working through like lived, embodied differences in order to come to something that's more equal. Does that make sense?
Right.
Actually, maybe that's a good pivot to talk about my recallable book, which is basically a book from the moment of the guilt moment. So the book that I was thinking of is Nicholas Lehmann's The Big Test. And I think it's 1999, but it's the secret history of the American meritocracy. And so it's about the SAT, and it's actually about, it's certainly about the privilege accorded to the old Ivies, but also, as somebody mentioned earlier, the public Ivies, like the way in which places like University of Michigan and University of California also had a kind of hyper porous screening mechanism that could draw people up into their world without fundamentally deranging the quality of the elite education they were offering. So it's just a fascinating, for me, it helped me think about how the American paradigm of public education has always had these internal differentiations in it. But the thing that I wanted to say that relates to the guilt point is that, Lehmann does do a good job of explaining how this kind of new access into privileged education came out of the post-war American sense that somehow society had to be committed to democratic openness, even though people weren't willing to allow that process to go completely. At least they had to sort of provide some kind of redemptive narrative.
Yeah.
And so I guess in a way it's the case to be made for hypocrisy, then that hypocrisy does produce some element of openness. But it's just a fascinating and it's granular account of how these educational systems can change superficially in so many ways without changing behind the scenes. It's so worth reading.
Yeah. There's another book by this intellectual historian, John Carson. It's called, forgetting the title, The Measure of Merit. And it's a comparison of France and the U.S.
Oh, I'd love to read that.
And the sort of like the twist in it is that France is the society, I suppose, that comes up with the IQ test, right? And the IQ test becomes all the rage in the United States. People pick it up and run with it. Because it fits so well with ideologies of individualism, right? This idea of the kind of objective, quantitative measurement of merit, whereas it falls by the wayside in France, right? Where where the sort of notion of institutions and kind of expert judgment is so powerful, right? That the test is not allowed to kind of stand in.
Interesting.
So that would be an interesting.
Yeah, that would be a great comparison.
Yeah. So mine is actually, every time John does not bring up a 19th century novel, I feel that I must.
Great.
And in this case, it is Phineas Finn, which is written by Anthony Trollope. It's one of the Palliser novels. And I thought of it because, Phineas Finn is a member of the Irish gentry, but he's Catholic and he's Irish, which is also kind of marked, right? And he comes to London and he actually does very well. But there's a lot of conversation about him doing well, the reasons why he's doing well, even though he's Catholic and Irish. And there's quite a lot of sort of anti-Irish sentiment throughout Trollope's books. And, it comes down to these questions of breeding. He looks good in a coat. He knows how to hunt, a variety of ways in which he kind of displays his capacity to join his merit, right? And the other part of it that I found interesting and relevant is that this is a time when not tests to enter universities, but tests to enter the civil service are being instituted, so that it's not only the children of the aristocracy or the gentry that are entering these things. And there's a lot of discussion. I mean, Trollope is really great about kind of bringing up these political questions sort of through the course of his plotting. And one of them is about and he's a little agnostic, like he's describing this as a kind of outrage, but there's also a little bit of a feeling that there's a sort of sociological take on it as well, right? Of sort of, why the country is going to the dogs, because now this exam is being instituted.
Yeah, and there's a couple of great recent books, one by Jennifer Ruth and one by Lauren Goodlad, that are both accounts of basically the understanding of the profession and the career as diverging at this moment, because the career is bureaucratically pegged to this kind of objective test, whereas the profession and something like doctor or lawyer would be the superb example that has this kind of internalized merit account. Like the doctor is doing things on their own and they're somehow, away apart from that kind of quantitative.
And then the other part of it is the
quality versus the quantity.
Right? Who's explicitly understood to not know what the hell he's doing, Trollope, right? And to not have any merit. And yet the idea that, and they're sort of elected through these, what are called rotten boroughs, where it's like basically the squire's decision who's going to be elected to parliament, and then they go and they sit there and they don't say anything for years on end. But
that's quality. That's ascription. Come to think of it, that's actually ascription. That's really helpful. Okay.
And I think it connects
I'll have to reread Middlemarch with ascription
that sort of earlier phase in the St. Paul's book, where it's kind of like it's kind of understood that these people are fuck ups and they don't ever go to class. They have a gentleman's C, right? And they spend all their time getting drunk. And yet that's sort of...
And yet it has bearing
in some weird way. Right. That's the thing that we are supposed to be preserving from the hordes that are come out of it involved. So
so there's so many campus novels that have that quality. I was actually thinking about Donna Tartt's Secret History, which is like my favorite campus novel. That the thing you think you're there for is not the thing you're actually there for. That it's oblique to the putative certified reason for coming, and then there's that underneath.
Right. With that, and the knowing of that secret is part of your belonging, right?
Yeah, and that's more than nonchalance. That's something other than nonchalance.
And if you actually mistake one for the other, I mean, that's the worst kind of naivete. That's when you really know you don't. But you're there for is the grade.
Exactly.
Yeah. So mine it's a memoir by a woman named Sujata Gidla, who's actually trained. She's a Dalit. And she's from a Christian Dalit family in South India. And she was trained as an engineer. She went to one of these regional engineering colleges, not the kind of top tier, but the next tier. And also was a kind of research scholar at IIT Madras for a time. And now works, migrated to the US, and now works as a conductor in the New York City subway.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of these stories which is the story of modern India. So the subtitle is An Untouchable Family and the Making of Modern India. And the title is Ants Among Elephants.
Wow, that sounds great.
And it's this remarkable story. And sort of the two, think of it as, the story of the post-independence period from the vantage point of a Dalit family's experience, and a kind of a multi-generational account of a Dalit family's experience. And so the two characters that really sort of jump out and that are kind of the stars of the story are her maternal uncle, who ends up being this kind of communist radical, right? And who is hell-bent on sort of organizing the peasantry for revolution, right? But he's also this incredibly complicated figure, right? Who, falls in love with a kind of upper caste girl and is shunned by her, and just is there's nothing sort of one-dimensional about any of these characters. Her mother is this really interesting character who's kind of forced into an arranged marriage, but is this kind of shining star on her horizon, and lines things up in such a way that she's afforded every possible opportunity, right? And it's this. So, but she has this like really amazing way of talking about how caste, and especially to be a Dalit, was inescapable, right? That you couldn't but be a Dalit. So the sort of aspiration to unmarking wasn't even thinkable. Right? It's not thinkable. But she also says that, it was only when she came to the United States that she thought of her story as a story, right? So just to give you a taste of it, she says, she starts, my stories, my family's stories were not stories in India. They were just life. When I left and made new friends in a new country, only then did the things that happened to my family, the things we had done, become stories. Stories worth telling, stories worth
kind of like Chris's
down.
book, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then each of these is a paragraph. Okay, then the next one is, I was born in South India in a town called Kazipet in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Next paragraph. I was born into a lower middle class family. My parents were college lecturers. I was born in untouchable. Right? So it's a kind of like coming to consciousness story, but one where she was always conscious, right? So it's quite remarkable, and I haven't read anything like it.
That sounds great.
And there's a whole tradition of the kind of Dalit memoir. There are precursors to this that are kind of in the same vein. But there's something about hers which is almost more compelling because it's so unsentimental, right? And it's transnational, right? Which gives it a kind of unique twist.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's my recommendation.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, with that, we will say goodbye to Ajantha for the moment, and thank you very much for this conversation. And thank you, John.
So much. Yeah.
Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. It is affiliated with Public Books and is recorded and edited in the Media Lab of the Brandeis Library by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of colleagues here in the Boston area and beyond. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy, Fly Away. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden, and production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Matthew Schratz and Kaliska Ross. Mark DeLello oversees and advises on all technological matters, and we appreciate the support of University Librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean of Arts and Sciences Dorothy Hodgson, and at the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly at ferry or at plots@brandeis.edu, or contact us via social media and our website. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review of us on iTunes, Stitcher, or elsewhere. You may be interested in checking out past episodes, including topics like log, deindustrialization, Polynesia, or some other angle altogether. Other episodes, which we're calling Recall This Book in Focus, include conversations with Samuel Delaney, Zadie Smith, Anik Lee, and more to come. And with that, thank you, and good day.